No es ningún secreto que Vladimir Putin lleva tiempo intentando hacerse con el control efectivo del grupo paramilitar Wagner y por esta razón que está dando pasos para lograr ese objetivo. Según compartía el Kremlin este viernes en un comunicado, en jornadas anteriores el mandatario ruso se habría reunido con Andrei Troshev, quien era un excomandante y miembro fundador de este grupo de mercenarios. Reunión que habría tenido la finalidad de trasladarle el encargo de que forme unidades de voluntarios para enviar a Ucrania a las primeras líneas de combate y que así aporten su experiencia de combate a las tropas que ya están desplegadas en el lugar. Ahora bien, en este mismo comunicado señalaban desde Moscú, además de con Troshev, Putin se habría reunido más recientemente también con su viceministro de Defensa para tratar la posibilidad de ofrecer, decían, garantías sociales a aquellos que habían estado defendiendo la patria. Pero Putin no solo quiere ampliar el control sobre más efectivos en lo que llama su operación militar especial, también quiere demostrar su poder y control sobre las 4 regiones que anexionó de forma ilegal hace ya un año. El Ministerio de Defensa ruso informaba este viernes que a partir de este domingo 1 de octubre van a llamar a filas, van a empezar a reclutar a todos aquellos jóvenes que se encuentran en estas 4 áreas. De esta forma, estiman, en la convocatoria de este otoño podrían llegar a incluir cerca de 130.000 reclutas para que cumplan con el servicio militar obligatorio de 12 meses. Eso sí, señalan que en ningún caso serán desplegados en las zonas donde a día de hoy se están llevando a término los combates más hostiles dentro de esta guerra. Para CNN, Pau Mosquera, Madrid.
Sin el presidente Putin, pero con un concierto en la Plaza Roja de Moscú, Rusia marcó el primer aniversario de la anexión de 4 regiones ucranianas. El evento llevó el lema "Un país, una familia, una Rusia", haciendo eco de la retórica oficial del Kremlin sobre la llamada reunificación de las regiones de Donetsk, Luhansk, Jersón y Zaporilla. Aquel anuncio del 30 de septiembre de 2022 siguió a los llamados referendos que fueron descartados como falsos por Ucrania y por Occidente. Pero Putin sí participó este viernes de la apertura de la conferencia parlamentaria Rusia-América Latina en la capital de su país, un encuentro que se extenderá hasta el lunes 2 de octubre. En su discurso, Putin dijo que ve con buenos ojos la idea de profundizar la cooperación con América Latina, señaló que es partidario de una Latinoamérica fuerte, independiente y exitosa, y se mostró satisfecho de que varios países de la región tengan la intención de sumarse al grupo BRICS, donde también están Brasil, la India, China y Sudáfrica. Van los recién agregados, o los que se van a agregar en enero: Etiopía, Egipto, Argentina, Irán y Arabia Saudita.
This is a day to remember those that have died, taking their lives, taking that sacrifice really for their country. That is what Zelensky wants to project here, that these are sacrifices, really quite grave, serious sacrifices people are making on a daily basis to continue this fight against the Russian invasion. But of course, as always with Zelensky, there is a global message as well as a national message. And while this is a national day of remembrance, a national day of mourning for the lives that have been lost in this conflict, it's also a day to tell the world about why they continue to need support, why they continue to need aid and assistance from their Western allies, as you've been discussing, that may now be in doubt from some allies, including the United States, and why also this sacrifice is so significant. This is really about life and death for the Ukrainians. And also, it's worth noting that today is not only the day of this remembrance, but also it's the first day of military conscription in the annexed areas as well, in these areas such as Kherson, Zaporizhia, Luhansk, Donetsk, areas that are currently under Russian occupation. Those areas are now going to have military conscription into, of course, the Russian army. So this is really demonstrating how significant this war is for Ukrainian civilians on a day-to-day basis, and therefore to remember the lives lost, the sacrifices people have made, is of extraordinary national significance. And as we're seeing this global support for Ukraine waver effectively, not just with the US spending bill that we've been discussing this morning, but also if we look at Europe as well. We've been talking this morning about Slovakia potentially potentially having a political shift. We've also been seeing in the last couple of weeks that dispute with Poland over grain that was then resolved. But again, it shows how fragile that support is from Ukraine's allies and how crucial it is for Zelensky to ensure that as we go into the winter months, this counteroffensive gradually progressing but dragging really, particularly as we head into these colder weather in the winter months. Really, this is something that Zelensky is concerned about. He needs this Western support. And so these kinds of moments of global reckoning, of remembering the lives lost, showing the Ukrainian sacrifice on a day-to-day basis are of incredible political and symbolic significance as well.
Well, the Ukrainians certainly are aware of some of the skepticism in the United States about funding for Ukraine, especially as far as weapons are concerned, but also, of course, as far as money is concerned as well, among congressional Republicans and also, of course, among the U.S. public. Now, Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of the country, was, of course, recently in the United States, and he was asking for more weapons because the Ukrainians understand that if they're going to stay in the fight against the Russians and make headway against the Russians, they are going to need a lot more weapons. Now, there's some items that the Ukrainians have said in the future will be absolutely key to them, like, for instance, ATACMS missiles is definitely something that they want. And of course, in the future, also F-16s to essentially rebuild their air force according to NATO's standard. They also think those jets are a lot more capable than the ones that they're flying right now. But in the short term, the Ukrainians say it really is ammunition that they need, and they certainly need a lot of. And one of the interesting things that Volodymyr Zelensky made a point of doing is saying, look, there has been some talk about possible corruption within the defense ministry here in Ukraine. He said nothing had to do with weapons that were provided by the United States. And one of the things, of course, that he also did is he replaced his defense minister pretty much right before coming to the U.S. and took that new defense minister to the United States to reassure the U.S. that if it gives weapons and when it gives weapons to Ukraine, it would be a transparent process. The Ukrainians fully understand that without further weapons from the United States and also its partners, they're going to have a very difficult time sustaining some of the high-level operations that they're conducting right now. Fred Pleitgen, CNN in eastern Ukraine.
What would that mean if the United States were to just stop funding aid to Ukraine, assistance to Ukraine?
Yeah, Jim, in one word, it would be a disaster. And the reason it would be a disaster is that Ukraine is really dependent on the kind of aid that we're providing it. We are, in terms of sheer dollar numbers, the biggest donor to the Ukrainians in terms of GDP per capita. There are other countries like some of the Baltic states that are actually donating more than we are. But in terms of raw numbers, we are the biggest single donor to the Ukrainians. And we also have the weaponry. So from a military standpoint, what you're looking at, Jim, is a situation where all of the ammunition that gets to Ukraine, or at least a large portion of it, would be stopped in the pipeline at some point. They would not be getting Abrams tanks any more than what they already have. They wouldn't be getting the F-16s that they've asked for. They wouldn't be getting any of the HIMARS systems that they've gotten and that they would need to replace, some of the parts that would get worn out. So all of that would stop, and in essence, what you'd be seeing is the counteroffensive. If we think it's stalled now, it would really get stalled, and the risk would be that the Russians could then come in and mount their own counteroffensive, and the Ukrainians would have a lot less hardware to stop them with. And that is an extremely dangerous situation and would really reverse all of the gains that the Ukrainians have made so far.
And Colonel Leighton, I mean, beyond that, just the mechanics of supporting the Ukrainians and arming them as they mount this counteroffensive, I guess what kind of statement would it send to the world if the United States were to all of a sudden pull the rug out from under the Ukrainians? And what message would be received in the Kremlin by Vladimir Putin? Because it sounds like from what you're saying is that maybe Vladimir Putin might see a bit of a green light here, an opening to ramp things up and see if he could crush the Ukrainians while he maybe had a window of opportunity if the United States is starting to go wobbly.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And, Jim, when the Kremlin looks at this, they are looking for any sign of weakness. And the kind of weaknesses that they'd be looking for would be a thing like a stopping in funding, a stopping in the supply line, whether it's due to funding or some operational issue. They are really focused on those kinds of things. And as far as the signal to the rest of the world is concerned, what you'd be dealing with there is also a signal of weakness, lack of resolve on the part of the United States. You kind of look at it in the lens perhaps from the 1970s and 1980s, compare what the United States, how the United States was perceived in the 1970s, in Europe and in the Soviet Union, and then how the United States was perceived in the 1980s. It was a world of difference. And it's that in essence, that peace through strength doctrine that becomes important. And in that, the corollary to that would be you have to supply the people that are doing your fighting for you. And in this particular case, the Ukrainians are definitely doing the fighting for us, because the Russians look at this as just one chapter in a war that they already say they're fighting with the West and especially with the United States.